I'm Charlotte, 29 female. I live in a small, meticulously organized apartment that overlooks the city's quietest park, a sanctuary I designed for myself after years of living in the chaos of my family home. By trade, I am an architectural drafter, a profession that requires precision, patience, and an eye for structure, qualities that were starkly absent in my family's dynamics. My life was a carefully constructed blueprint, but I was about to discover that the foundations were built on a fault line of deception, and the tremors were just beginning. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The air in my mother's house was always thick with the cloying scent of potpourri and unspoken resentment. It was Josephine's 58th birthday, an occasion she orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. Every throw pillow was fluffed, every silver utensil polished, and every guest was expected to play their assigned role in the grand theater of her perfect family. My role, as usual, was the quiet, agreeable daughter, the one who blended into the background like the tasteful, beige wallpaper she had recently chosen for the dining room. My brother Jasper arrived with his wife Louise in tow. Jasper, a financial advisor who measured a person's worth by their portfolio, strode in with an air of self-importance that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Louise, a marketing manager, followed him like a beautifully curated accessory, her smile bright but her eyes constantly scanning, assessing. "Charlotte, darling," she said, air-kissing my cheek. "Still in that little apartment of yours? We must find you a proper place." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a judgment. I forced a smile. "I like my apartment, Louise, it's home." "Of course, dear," she replied, her tone dripping with pity before she glided away to join the main cluster of guests. My mother, Josephine, was the queen bee, flitting between conversations, her laughter a little too loud, her compliments laced with subtle barbs. She was an interior designer and her home was her showroom, a testament to her impeccable taste and her ability to control every element within it, including her children. She cornered me by the overloaded buffet table. "Charlotte, you look pale. Are you working too hard? You know, that drafting job doesn't seem to have much of a future." Jasper was just telling me about a junior position at his firm. "I'm happy where I am, Mom," I said, my voice barely a whisper. This was a familiar dance. My career was a disappointment, my single status a failure, my quiet nature a personality flaw. Jasper was the golden child, his lucrative career and well-connected wife a constant source of pride for her. I was the fixer-upper project she'd never quite managed to complete. As the evening wore on, a familiar tightness began to creep into my chest. It started as a faint pressure, like a book laid flat against my sternum. I tried to ignore it, attributing it to the stress of the evening. It had been happening more frequently over the past few months, a strange, fluttering sensation in my heart, a shortness of breath that would come and go without warning. I'd mentioned it to my mother once, a few weeks prior, after a particularly bad episode that left me dizzy and weak. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Charlotte," she'd scoffed, not even looking up from her design magazine. "It's just anxiety, you need to get out more." Jasper had overheard and chimed in, "She's always been like this. Anything for a bit of attention." The memory stung, and the tightness in my chest intensified. I discreetly pressed a hand against my heart, trying to take a slow, deep breath, but the air wouldn't come. The pressure was building, no longer a book but a heavy weight, and a sharp, radiating pain began to shoot down my left arm. The room started to feel distant, the chatter of the party fading into a dull roar. I leaned against the wall for support, my vision starting to tunnel. I had to get someone's attention, but the words were trapped in my throat. I stumbled towards the living room where my mother was holding court, laughing at one of Jasper's anecdotes. My legs felt like lead. Each step was a monumental effort. I managed to catch my mother's eye, my own wide with a silent plea. I saw a flash of annoyance cross her face before it was replaced by a theatrical sigh. "What is it now, Charlotte?" she asked, her voice carrying across the room, causing a few conversations to falter. All eyes turned to me. My chest, I managed to gasp, clutching it with both hands now. The pain was searing. Something's wrong. Stop being so dramatic, my mom yelled, her voice sharp with exasperation. The embarrassment was a hot wave that washed over me, competing with the cold dread that was spreading. Through my veins, you're ruining my party. My brother rolled his eyes, a smirk playing on his lips. He turned to the guest next to him and said, loud enough for me to hear, "She just wants attention." Laughter rippled through the small group around him. Humiliation was a bitter pill, but the pain was a raging fire that was consuming everything. I couldn't breathe. My knees buckled and I slid down the wall, my hand knocking a small end table. A porcelain figurine, a shepherdess my mother cherished, crashed to the floor and shattered. The sound was sharp and final, and for a moment, it cut through the noise of the party. Every single person, including my mother and brother, stared first at the broken pieces on the floor, and then at me, their expressions a mixture of shock and irritation. No one moved. No one came to help. They just stared as my world dissolved into a swirling vortex of pain and darkness. The last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was my mother's face, her mouth a tight line of fury, not in concern for me, but for her broken ornament. The moments that followed were a blur, a disjointed series of snapshots viewed through a hazy filter. I was vaguely aware of a distant voice, sharp and authoritative, cutting through the fog. There was a sense of motion, of being lifted. The muffled sounds of the party had been replaced by a more urgent, focused energy. My eyes fluttered open to the sight of a textured ceiling I didn't recognize, and then a face, framed by the concerned frown of a stranger. "Can you hear me? My name is Philip, I'm a paramedic." The voice was calm but firm, grounding me in the chaos. "We're going to take care of you." I tried to nod, but even that small movement felt exhausting. The pain in my chest was a constant, throbbing beast, but the sharpest edges had been dulled slightly by a new sensation, the prick of a needle in my arm. I could hear other voices now, my mother, among them, high-pitched and defensive. "I don't understand what all the fuss is about," she was saying to someone, likely the other paramedic. "She's always been prone to hysterics. She fainted, that's all, probably hasn't eaten all day." "Ma'am, we need you to step back," another voice said patiently. "We need to work." "Work, she just needs to sit up and have some water. Jasper, tell them." "It's true," Jasper's voice chimed in, smooth and confident. "My sister has a history of anxiety attacks. She gets overwhelmed at family events and does this to get out of them. It's a pattern." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them they were wrong, that this was different, that the pain was real. But my body was a leaden weight, and my voice was a forgotten tool. All I could do was lie there, a prisoner in my own failing body, and listen to the narrative my family was spinning for the paramedics. The story of me, the fragile, attention-seeking drama queen. Philip, the paramedic by my side, seemed unfazed by their commentary. His focus was entirely on me. He was checking my pulse, his fingers pressed firmly against my wrist. His eyes were fixed on his watch, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then his expression shifted. It was a subtle change, a tightening of his jaw, a flicker of something sharp and urgent in his gaze. He looked up at his partner, his voice low but clear and carrying an unmistakable weight of alarm. "I have a thready pulse, barely there. Get the stretcher now." The change in the room was instantaneous. It was as if a switch had been flipped, plunging the party atmosphere into a stark, cold silence. The casual dismissal, the annoyed whispers, the confident pronouncements of my family, it all evaporated. In its place was a thick, heavy quiet, punctuated only by the frantic rustle of medical equipment. My mother's protestations died in her throat. Jasper's smug certainty vanished. I saw them from the corner of my eye, their faces frozen, masks of disbelief and dawning horror. The word stretcher was a key turning a lock. It was a word that didn't belong in their world of curated perfection and polite fictions. It belonged to real emergencies, to life and death, not to what they had dismissed as my pathetic bid for attention. The silence was their shock. It was the sound of their carefully constructed reality cracking at the seams. As the paramedics worked with swift, practiced efficiency, securing me to the stretcher, I made eye contact with my mother. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a confusion that was slowly being eclipsed by fear. It wasn't fear for me, not yet. It was the fear of being wrong, of being exposed. The fear of what the neighbors would think when they saw an ambulance at her perfect party. Jasper stood behind her, his arms crossed, but his confident posture was a fragile facade. He looked not at me, but at the grim-faced paramedics, as if trying to find a flaw in their assessment, a reason to reinstate his version of the truth. The journey from the live-in. G-room to the front door was a parade of shame, not for me, but for them. The guests, who had moments before been laughing at my expense, now parted like a silent, gaping sea. They averted their eyes, unable to look at me, unable to look at my family. Their complicit smirks were gone, replaced by awkward, uncomfortable sympathy. They were witnesses now, not just to a medical emergency, but to a moment of profound cruelty that had been laid bare under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the paramedics, flashlights. As they wheeled me out into the cool night air, the flashing lights of the ambulance painting streaks of red and white across the pristine facade of my mother's house, I took a ragged breath. The pain was still there, a fire in my chest, but something else was beginning to smolder alongside it, a cold, hard knot of anger. They had stood by. They had mocked me. They had yelled at me to stop being dramatic while my body was screaming for help. In that moment, strapped to a stretcher, I was more alone than I had ever been, but I was also, for the first time, seeing things with a brutal, terrifying clarity. The tapestry of lies that my family had woven around me for years was unraveling, thread by painful thread. The inside of the ambulance was a world away from my mother's tastefully decorated home. It was a small, sterile space, all function and no pretense, filled with the urgent beeps and whirs of machines that had no opinion, that only dealt in facts. Philip and his partner moved around me with a practiced rhythm, their voices a calm, steady murmur of medical jargon. An oxygen mask was placed over my face, and the cool air was a balm to my struggling lungs. The pain in my chest, which had been a raging inferno, was now being banked by the medication flowing into my veins, but the echo of it remained, a ghost of the agony I had felt while my family stood by and watched. The silence from my family was a stark contrast to the activity in the ambulance. After their initial, panicked pronouncements were brushed aside by the paramedics. They had been rendered mute. My mother had insisted on riding in the ambulance with me, a move that I knew was more about maintaining the appearance of a concerned parent than any genuine worry. She sat on the bench opposite me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her designer dress looking garishly out of place in the clinical environment. She kept opening her mouth as if to speak, to offer a platitude or perhaps another excuse, but she always seemed to think better of it. The certainty had been stripped from her, leaving behind a raw, uncertain fear. She wasn't looking at me, but at the heart monitor, her eyes fixated on the jagged, rhythmic line as if it were a foreign language she was desperately trying to decipher. Jasper and Louise had followed in his car, and I could only imagine the tense, whispered conversation taking place within it. I could picture Jasper, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his mind racing to reframe the situation in a way that would absolve him of any blame. He would be rationalizing, explaining away their inaction, probably already crafting the narrative they would present to the rest of the family. We had no idea. She never said it was this serious. She's always been so dramatic. How were we to know? The excuses were as predictable as they were infuriating. At the hospital, the controlled chaos of the emergency room swallowed me whole. I was a collection of symptoms, a series of readings on a chart, a puzzle for the doctors to solve. There was an EKG, blood tests, a chest X-ray. A cardiologist was called in, a serious-looking woman with kind eyes who spoke to me directly, not to my mother who hovered anxiously in the doorway. "Charlotte," she said, her voice gentle but direct. "You've had a significant cardiac event. We're still running tests to determine the exact cause, but it appears to be a condition called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, also known as broken heart syndrome. It's a temporary condition where your heart muscle becomes suddenly stunned or weakened, often brought on by severe emotional or physical stress. The name was almost poetic, a strangely beautiful label for such an ugly experience. Broken heart syndrome. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. My heart was literally broken, not by a lost love, but by the casual cruelty of the people who were supposed to love me most. My mother, hearing the doctor's words, finally found her voice. "Stress," she repeated, stepping into the room. "What stress could she possibly have? She has a simple job, a nice apartment. Her life is not stressful." The doctor turned to face her, her expression unreadable. "Emotional stress can be a powerful trigger, Mrs. Evans. It's not for me to say what caused it, but the physical evidence is undeniable. Charlotte's heart has undergone significant trauma." Josephine fell silent again, the doctor's words a clinical, irrefutable indictment of the environment she had created. There was no room for argument, no space for her to insert her own narrative. The EKG strip, with its erratic peaks and valleys, told a truer story than she ever could. Jasper and Louise arrived a few minutes later, their faces carefully arranged into masks of concern. Jasper came to my bedside, placing a hand awkwardly on my arm. "Char, my God, we were so worried. When the paramedics said, well, we just couldn't believe it. Why didn't you tell us you were feeling this unwell?" The question was so audacious, so completely divorced from the reality of what had happened, that for a moment I was speechless. A bubble of hysterical laughter threatened to rise in my throat. I had told them. I had gasped and pleaded and clutched my chest, and they had told me I was being dramatic. I looked at him, at his earnest, feigned concern, and I felt nothing but a cold, desolate emptiness. The anger from earlier had cooled into a hard, dense stone in my stomach. "I tried," I said, my voice hoarse from the oxygen mask. "Well, you have to be clearer, Charlotte," Louise chimed in from the foot of the bed, her tone one of gentle chiding, as if she were correcting a child's minor mistake. "We're not mind readers. If you're in that much pain, you need to use your words." Their ability to rewrite history in real time was breathtaking. They were already smoothing over the jagged edges of their own behavior, recasting themselves as the concerned, if slightly misguided, family members. In their version of the story, the fault was mine, a failure of communication. The silence of the stretcher had been broken, and in its place, the familiar, toxic narrative was being hastily reassembled. But something had shifted in me. Lying in that hospital bed, with the steady beep of the monitor as my only companion, I realized that their words no longer had the power to wound me. They were just noise, the meaningless static of a radio station I was no longer listening to. I had heard their truth in the silence, in their inaction, in their rolled eyes and exasperated sighs. What they were saying now was for them, not for me. It was the frantic patching of a story that was already full of holes. And I, for the first time, had no interest in helping them stitch it back together. I simply turned my head on the pillow, faced the wall, and closed my eyes, leaving them to talk to the empty space where their sister and daughter used to be. The next few days in the cardiac care unit were a cocoon of quiet beeps, soft-soled shoes, and hushed conversations. The doctors and nurses were my primary companions, a rotating cast of professionals who treated me with a gentle, impersonal kindness that was more comforting than any of my family's strained attempts at affection had ever been. They explained that my recovery would be slow, that the priority was to let my heart muscle heal from the shock it had endured. The diagnosis of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy was confirmed. My heart wasn't permanently damaged, but it was severely weakened. The cardiologist, Dr. Aris, was blunt. "Your heart is, for all intents and purposes, bruised and battered, Charlotte. You need to eliminate the source of the acute stress in your life. It's not a suggestion, it's a medical necessity." My family visited daily, turning my quiet hospital room into a stage for their performance of contrition. They brought flowers that were too big and balloons that were too cheerful, filling the small space with a cloying, artificial brightness. Josephine would fuss over my blankets and complain about the quality of the hospital food, carefully avoiding any discussion of the night of her party. It was as if she believed that by ignoring the cause, the effect would simply vanish. Jasper would stand awkwardly by the window, talking about his work, dropping hints about the important deals he was closing, as if to remind me of the real world where he was successful and I was here. Louise would perch on the edge of a chair, scrolling through her phone, occasionally offering a bland, "You're looking a bit better today, dear," without ever really looking at me. They were all playing their parts, waiting for me to play mine, the part of the forgiving daughter and sister who would absolve them of their guilt, who would reassure them that it was all a big misunderstanding. They needed me to say, "It wasn't your fault," so that they could return to their comfortable lives, the memory of my collapse relegated to a strange and unpleasant anecdote. But I remained silent. I answered their questions with single words. I kept my eyes on the television or a book. My silence was a wall, and with each visit they would press against it, their frustration growing. "Charlotte, we're trying here," Jasper finally burst out one afternoon, his voice tight with irritation. "We're bringing you things, we're visiting every day. What more do you want from us?" "I want you to leave," I said, my voice quiet but firm. The words hung in the air, sharp and shocking. Louise gasped. Jasper stared at me, his mouth agape. My mother, who had been rearranging a bouquet of lilies for the third time, froze, her back rigid. "Well, I never," she finally stammered, turning to face me. "After all we've done, we've been worried sick." "No," I replied, my voice gaining strength. "You were annoyed. You were embarrassed. You were worried about what people would think. You weren't worried about me until a man with a medical degree told you that you should be." The truth of it, spoken so plainly, seemed to physically wound them. They flinched. Jasper's face reddened with anger. "That's not fair, Charlotte. We didn't know." "You didn't want to know," I corrected him. "It was easier to believe I was being dramatic. It's what you've always believed. Any time I had a problem or a feeling that was inconvenient for you, I was being dramatic or seeking attention. You've been saying it my whole life. The difference is that this time, it almost killed me." A nurse chose that moment to enter, her cheerful demeanor faltering slightly as she took in the tense scene. "Everything okay in here?" she asked, her eyes darting between us. "We were just leaving," my mother said, her voice clipped and cold. She grabbed her purse, refusing to look at me. Jasper shot me a look of pure venom before stalking out of the room, with Louise scurrying behind him. The silence they left behind was profound. It was a clean, healing silence, not the heavy, accusatory silence of the stretcher. In that quiet, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of the truth. My entire life had been a performance for their benefit. I had shrunk myself down, made myself quieter, less demanding, all in the futile hope of earning their love and approval. I had swallowed my own needs and feelings for so long that my body had finally revolted in the only way it knew how. The problem wasn't my heart, it was them. They were the disease. That evening, a new visitor appeared at my door. It was Philip, the paramedic who had first attended to me. He was in his civilian clothes, looking a little awkward and holding a small, potted plant. "I hope this is okay," he said, gesturing with the plant. "I was on a call nearby and I wanted to see how you were doing. Your case stuck with me." "Please come in," I said, surprised and genuinely touched. He took the visitor's chair, the one my family had so recently vacated. "I don't want to overstep," he began, "but I've been a paramedic for 15 years. I've seen a lot of things. And I've never seen a family react the way yours did. When your brother told me you had a history of this and your mother was complaining about her party, I had a feeling something else was going on." Tears welled in my eyes, hot and unexpected. It was the first time someone had validated my experience without me having to argue or defend it. He had seen it. He had known. "They've always been like that," I confessed, the words spilling out. "I'm just the dramatic one." He nodded slowly, his expression full of a deep, weary understanding. "Sometimes, the people who are supposed to be your safe harbor are actually the storm. I just wanted you to know that why." "Oh, weren't crazy. What happened to you was real. The pain was real." His words were a key, unlocking a part of my heart that had been closed off for years. He wasn't a doctor or a therapist, but his simple, honest validation was more healing than any medicine they could give me. He didn't stay long, but his visit was a turning point. He had seen the hidden truth of my heart, both literally and figuratively. And in his kindness, he had shown me that I wasn't alone, and that I deserved to be seen, to be believed, and to be protected. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was the only one who could give myself that protection now. The blueprint of my life was flawed, the foundation rotten. It was time to draw up a new one. Being discharged from the hospital felt less like a homecoming and more like being released on my own recognizance. I didn't go back to my apartment, not at first. The thought of being alone, even in my own carefully curated sanctuary, felt daunting. Instead, I called the one person in my life who had always been a source of unwavering support, my best friend Hannah. When I told her a fraction of what had happened, she didn't hesitate. "My spare room is your room," she said. "For as long as you need it." Hannah's apartment was the antithesis of my mother's home. It was a cozy, cluttered space filled with books, half-finished knitting projects, and the comforting aroma of herbal tea. There was no pretense, no judgment, just a warm, unconditional acceptance that felt like a lifeline. For the first week, I did little more than sleep. My body and my heart were exhausted. I was on a cocktail of medications to support my cardiac function, and they left me feeling foggy and weak. Hannah would check on me, leaving trays of simple food and cups of tea by my bed, never pushing me to talk, just being present. Slowly, the fog began to lift. With the physical distance from my family came a profound mental clarity. My phone buzzed intermittently with texts from my mother. "Are you eating properly?" And "Jasper, you're being incredibly childish, Charlotte. It's time to come home and sort this out." I read them, a detached observer studying the artifacts of a life that no longer felt like my own, and then I deleted them without replying. Each deleted message was a small act of liberation, a snip of a thread in the toxic tapestry they had woven around me. My profession, the one my mother had so often derided, became my salvation. Architectural drafting is about creating clear, precise plans for a structure. It requires envisioning a space, defining its boundaries, and ensuring its structural integrity. I realized that was exactly what I needed to do for my own life. I needed to draft a new blueprint, one with firm boundaries and a foundation built on self-preservation, not on the shifting sands of my family's approval. I started with the practicalities. With Hannah's help, I found a therapist who specialized in family trauma. Our sessions were difficult, forcing me to confront years of suppressed anger and hurt. I learned about complex PTSD, about the insidious nature of emotional neglect, and about the roles my family members played in our dysfunctional system. My mother the narcissist, Jasper the golden child, and me the scapegoat, the designated carrier of all the family's problems. The label of dramatic was, my therapist explained, a classic tool used to dismiss my legitimate feelings and maintain the family's unhealthy equilibrium. Next, I tackled the legal and financial aspects. I met with a lawyer to draft a formal letter to my family. It was a simple, unemotional document that stated my need for a period of no contact. It outlined that all communication should cease immediately and that any attempts to contact me would be documented. It felt extreme, but necessary. This wasn't a negotiation, it was the construction of a firewall. I also met with a financial planner, a friend of Hannah's, to go over my finances. I wanted to ensure I was completely independent, that there were no hidden ties or dependencies that could be used as leverage against me. The biggest step, however, was professional. The simple job my mother looked down upon was about to become my fortress. I had been working for a small, respected firm for years, quietly building a reputation for my meticulous work and creative problem-solving. A few months before my collapse, I had been tentatively sketching out an idea for a passion project, a series of designs for sustainable, small-footprint community housing. It was a concept I was deeply passionate about, but I had always lacked the confidence to pursue it seriously, my mother's dismissive voice a constant echo in my head. Now that voice was silent, and in its place, my own was beginning to emerge. I spent my days at Hannah's kitchen table, my drafting tools spread out before me, and I worked. I poured all my pain, my anger, and my newfound clarity into those blueprints. I designed homes that were safe, efficient, and filled with light. I designed community spaces that fostered connection and support. I was, in essence, designing the world I had always craved. After a month of intensive work, I had a complete portfolio. It was the best work I had ever done. My boss, a man who had always been a quiet supporter, was floored. "Charlotte," he said, looking over the designs, "this is brilliant. It's visionary." He not only approved the project for a local design competition, but also promoted me to a senior project lead, giving me my own team to develop the concept further. It was a quiet victory, one celebrated not with a loud party, but with a simple dinner with Hannah. As I sat in her warm, book-filled apartment, I felt a sense of peace that was deeper and more real than anything I had ever known. I was building a new life, one of my own design. The foundation was solid. The walls were strong. And for the first time, I felt truly at home within myself. I had no idea if my family had received the lawyer's letter or what their reaction had been. And for the first time, I realized I didn't care. Their part of the blueprint had been erased. The future was an empty page, and I was holding the pen. Months passed, turning the crispness of autumn into the quiet chill of winter. My life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. My work on the community housing project was all-consuming and deeply rewarding. We won the initial design competition, which led to a grant and a pilot project partnership with the city. I was no longer just a drafter. I was a project leader, an innovator. The promotion came with a significant salary increase, and with it, a newfound sense of security and independence. I moved into a new apartment in a different part of the city, one my family had never been to. It was my space, filled with my choices, with no ghosts in the corners. My health improved dramatically. The follow-up appointments with Dr. Eris showed that my heart had healed completely. "Whatever you're doing," she said with a warm smile, "keep doing it. The change is remarkable." The tightness in my chest was gone, replaced by a sense of calm. I had continued with therapy, learning to recognize my own triggers and to validate my own feelings. I was building an emotional immune system that had been compromised for years. The wall of silence between my family and me remained absolute. I heard nothing from them, and I made no effort to reach out. The lawyer's letter had apparently worked. It was a strange, hollow feeling at times, like a phantom limb. A lifetime of conditioning doesn't vanish overnight, and there were moments, a birthday, a holiday, when a pang of something like guilt or loss would surface. But then I would remember the coldness in my mother's eyes, the smirk on my brother's face, and the feeling would recede, replaced by a quiet resolve. The first crack in the wall came in the form of a thick, cream-colored envelope that arrived at my office. My new address was unlisted, but they had found me at work. The return address was my mother's. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was not a letter, but an invitation. It was for my mother and Jasper's joint birthday party. Their birthdays were only a week apart, and Josephine loved the efficiency of a combined celebration. It was to be a lavish affair at a downtown hotel, a far cry from the tense gatherings at her house. Tucked inside the invitation was a handwritten note from my mother. Her elegant script, usually so controlled, was slightly shaky. "Charlotte, it has been too long. We are all worried about you. This silence is tearing the family apart. Jasper misses his sister. I miss my daughter. We are willing to forgive your outburst at the hospital. Let's put the past behind us. This party will be a chance for a fresh start for all of us. Please be there. Love, Mom." I read the note twice, then a third time. Each word was a masterclass in manipulation. "We are worried about you." Not, "We are sorry for what we did." This silence is tearing the family apart. My silence, my self-preservation, was the problem, not their actions. "We are willing to forgive your outburst." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of that sentence almost made me laugh. They were willing to forgive me. And finally, the classic refrain, "Let's put the past behind us." They didn't want to resolve the past. They wanted to bury it, to pretend it never happened so they could return to the comfortable status quo. The invitation was not an olive branch, it was a summons. It was a test to see if their control over me was truly broken. For a moment, a flicker of the old Charlotte, the one who craved their approval, surfaced. Maybe I should go, maybe I could show them how well I was doing, prove them wrong. But then I realized I had nothing to prove to them. My new life, my success, my peace, it wasn't for them. It was for me. Going to that party would be like a recovering alcoholic walking into a bar to prove they could have just one drink. It was a trap. I picked up the invitation and the note. I walked over to the industrial shredder in the corner of my office, a machine we used for destroying old, sensitive blueprints. I fed the thick, creamy cardstock into the slot. The machine whirred to life, and in a matter of seconds, the elegant invitation and my mother's manipulative words were reduced to a cascade of meaningless, cross-cut confetti. It was a deeply, profoundly satisfying sound. That evening, I did something I hadn't done before. I wrote them a letter. I didn't send it, and I never intended to. It was for me. I filled pages, not with anger or accusations, but with a calm, clear accounting of the truth. I wrote about the years of dismissal, the constant criticism, the pain of being called dramatic every time I expressed a need. I wrote about the terror and humiliation of that night, of collapsing while they mocked me. I wrote about the diagnosis, about the literal broken heart they had given me. Putting it all on paper was a final act of release. It was the conversation I would never have with them, because I knew they were incapable of truly hearing it. When I was finished, I folded the pages, placed them in an envelope, and wrote "unsent" on the front. I put it in a box in my closet with other mementos of a life I had left behind. The day of the party came and went. I spent the evening at Hannah's apartment, watching a movie and eating pizza, my phone turned off. I felt no regret, no sadness, only a quiet, liberating peace. The invitation had been their final, desperate attempt to pull me back into the old, toxic blueprint, but my foundation was too strong now. The unsent invitation was my declaration of independence. My new structure was complete, and there was no room in it for them. Life, I learned, continues on its own axis, regardless of the dramas we play out. My community housing project broke ground in the spring. Seeing the foundations being poured, the first walls being raised, was a tangible manifestation of the new life I had built for myself. It was real, solid, and created with purpose. The local news did a feature on the project, and I was interviewed as the lead designer. I spoke about the importance of creating safe, supportive spaces for people to thrive. I didn't mention my family, but the subtext was there. A quiet testament to my own journey from a place of profound emotional unsafety to one of strength and creation. The aftershocks of my departure from the family continued, though I only experienced them secondhand. Hannah, who still had a few tenuous social media connections to some of my extended family, became a reluctant filter for the fallout. She told me, months after the party I never attended, that my absence had been a glaring hole in the celebration. My mother had apparently told the guests I was unwell, a vague and martyred pronouncement that only fueled gossip. The story, as it filtered through the family grapevine, was that I had suffered some sort of breakdown and had selfishly and cruelly cut off the family that was trying to help me. They had, once again, rewritten the narrative to cast themselves as the victims and me as the villain. It was predictable, and for the first time, it didn't hurt. It simply was. The true echo, the one that reverberated with a satisfying finality, came nearly a year after my collapse. It was delivered by Louise, my sister-in-law, in a way she never intended. She had been headhunted for a senior marketing position at a large development firm, the very firm that had partnered with my company to fund and build the community housing project. She had apparently sailed through the initial interviews, her confidence and polished presentation making a strong impression. The final interview was with the project's executive board, which included the CEO of the development firm, my boss, and me, as the lead architect. I saw her name on the schedule the day before the interview, and a strange, calm resolve settled over me. I wasn't nervous or angry. I felt a detached curiosity, a sense of a circle closing. When Louise walked into the boardroom, she didn't see me at first. I was seated at the far end of the long table, next to the CEO. She focused on the men in the room, her smile bright and practiced. It was only when the CEO began the introductions that her eyes found me. And I believe you may already know the lead architect on this project, our brilliant designer from Sterling and Vance, Charlotte Evans. The transformation was astounding. All the color drained from Louise's face. Her professional, confident mask didn't just crack, it shattered. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, a fish gasping for air. In that moment, she was not a high-powered marketing executive. She was just a woman confronted by a ghost she thought she had helped to bury. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I simply met her gaze, my expression neutral, my posture calm and assured. The power dynamic, which had been so skewed for my entire life, had been completely inverted. In this room, my opinion mattered. My work spoke for itself. I was not the dramatic, attention-seeking sister-in-law. I was a respected professional, a key stakeholder in a multi-million-dollar project. She was the one seeking my approval. Her interview was a disaster. She stumbled over her answers, her carefully rehearsed lines forgotten. She couldn't take her eyes off me, and my quiet, steady presence seemed to unravel her completely. She tried to reference her connection to me, a desperate, fumbling attempt to curry favor. "Charlotte and I are family," she said, with a strained laugh. "We're very close." The CEO, a sharp, intuitive man, raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Charlotte, you didn't mention that." I looked at him, then back at Louise. "Louise is my brother's wife," I said, my voice even and clear. The correction was subtle but devastating. I did not claim her as family. I did not acknowledge her statement of closeness. I simply stated a fact, drawing a clear, undeniable line between us. She didn't get the job. The board felt she was flustered and lacked confidence under pressure. The irony was exquisite. I never heard from any of them again. Louise's humiliation in that boardroom was likely the final nail in the coffin. To acknowledge me now would be to acknowledge the power I held, the success I had built not just in spite of them, but because of my escape from them. Their silence was no longer a punishment they inflicted on me. It was a shield to protect their own fragile egos from the uncomfortable truth of who I had become. My life is quiet now, but it is not empty. It is filled with meaningful work, with the warmth of true friendship, and with the profound peace that comes from living authentically. My heart is strong, not just in a medical sense, but in its capacity to hold joy and to trust itself. Sometimes, in the quiet of my apartment, I think of my family in that big house, a space filled with beautiful things and unspoken truths. I imagine the echoes of their own making, the whispers of the daughter and sister who is no longer there to absorb their dysfunction. They are trapped in the blueprint they created, a structure with a rotten foundation, while I am out in the world building homes. My heart was broken, it's true. But in retrospect, I realize it wasn't an ending. It was a groundbreaking.